Okay, so hello and welcome to the second video. So in this video, we're going to continue talking about a firm's total production costs. But to do that, we're going to have to first figure out a way to more explicitly talk about a firm's production process. And the reason that is because a firm's production costs depend critically on productivity. And we can illustrate this concept using a simple example that's similar to one that Dr. Hyman went over in class. So let's assume that we have some imaginary product that can be produced using only labor. And so let's call this product widgets. And so let's say that widget manufacturers can hire labor on the labor market at a going rate of $10 per worker. And so let's say we've got this widget manufacturer, and you can hire one worker, and that one worker can produce one widget. Well, it should be obvious that the cost of producing that one widget is $10. And that's because the only cost that the firm has to incur is to hire that one worker at a cost of $10. So now let's say we have a second widget manufacturer that's, for whatever reason, able to employ workers that are twice as productive as the first widget manufacturer. So specifically, this firm can hire one worker, and that one worker can produce two widgets. So now it should be clear that the cost of producing one widget for this firm is going to be a lot lower than for the first firm. And this is because to produce one widget, it only has to pay for half of that worker's time. Because normally, if the worker worked full time, he'd be able to produce two widgets. So if they only pay for half of that worker's time, then they'll be able to produce one widget. And so the cost of half of that worker's time should be half the wage, or $5. So for this second firm, the cost of producing one widget should be $5, which is half of the cost of producing one widget for the first firm. So hopefully this illustrates why productivity is so important whenever we talk about costs. So if we want to talk about productivity, we're going to have to talk about the production process in a much more explicit way. And the way that we're going to do that is using this simple equation here that we call the production function. And so the production function is basically a simple way of talking about a firm's production process. And it basically says that a firm's output is a function of how much capital it employs and how much labor it employs. So the reason this is simple compared to actual production processes is that in the real world, firms require a lot more than just capital and labor to produce their products. For example, they may require electricity, they may have to purchase materials, or they may have to purchase services from other firms to produce their products. There's a lot of things that we're leaving out in this production function. But the reason that is because if we tried to become too realistic, then the entire discussion of the production function would just become way too complicated for what we're trying to capture. And what we're trying to capture is basically just a simple model of how firms produce their products and how that influences their decisions of how much to produce. So for the moment, this is the way that we are going to imagine a firm's production function. So for the rest of this conversation, we're going to simplify things even further by saying that we're just going to be focusing on the short run. And so if you remember in class, we defined the short run as being that period of time over which at least one of the inputs in a firm's production process is fixed. And for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to assume that it's capital that's fixed. So really, the only input that can vary is labor. So if a firm wants to produce more of its output, it's going to have to hire more labor because the amount of capital that it has is fixed. And there's only two inputs that can go into its production process, capital and labor. So if capital is fixed and it wants to produce more output, the only thing it can do is to hire more labor. So let's see what that means for a firm's production process. So here is a picture of a typical production function. So this says that as we hire, so as you can see, it's upward sloping. So what this says is that as a firm hires more labor, the output that that firm produces is going to increase, at least up to a point. But you'll notice that after a while, this function is increasing at a decreasing rate. And so what does that mean? Well, that means that after a certain point, each worker is becoming less productive than the previous worker. So each additional worker is less productive than the worker before him. And that process is going to continue until after some other point. It could be that each worker is not only each additional worker is not only less productive than the worker before him, he's also making the entire production process less productive, and thus the amount of output that the firm is able to produce actually starts to fall. So there's another way that we can illustrate this, and this is using marginal product. So let's see, so output per worker. So what we're saying here is that we see that over this range of production, as we hire more workers, each worker is becoming more productive than the worker before him. And so we would represent that as output per worker increasing the more labor we hire. Up until a certain point, right here, whenever diminishing returns sets in, and now we can see that after this point, each additional worker is becoming less productive. So output per worker after the point of diminishing returns sets in is less productive. And they are less productive and they're going to keep getting less productive until eventually we hit this other point where the total product curve starts to slope downward. And at this point, the marginal product curve goes negative. So at this point, the total amount of output that a firm produces is maximized, where the marginal product is zero. And beyond that point, total product actually starts to decline. Now, just to emphasize, that doesn't mean that a firm will want to produce here where total product is maximized, because what a firm is trying to do, as we explained in the last video, is to maximize profits, not to maximize production. And so what we're going to do in the next video is get one step closer to figuring out how it is a firm decides to maximize profits by combining this picture of total product and marginal product, and to get a expression, or rather a depiction of total costs and marginal costs. And as we saw in the last video, that is one piece of the two pieces we need to start talking intelligently about a firm's profit maximization problem. So that should be it for this video. I thank you for sitting and watching this, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thanks very much.